Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm going to try and remember everything I had to say because I didn't write anything down except Lloyd's bio usefully. I'm Colin, I teach in the English department here and I direct the Global Irish Studies program. Delighted that we're here in this room, where we've never been before, and it feels quite swanky, I have to say. So can we give a thumbs up? We'll be in this room again if we can. All right, good. Our usual thanks to Chris and Caroline in the back who have arranged and found this room and got food for us and made us all feel welcome and comfortable. Yes, what would we do without them? And to Alumni House and the Alumni Association, which is where we are very generous of them to let us and units like us use the room. I also want to thank the Department of English and especially the Medical Humanities program for co-sponsoring. Our colleague Lakshmi Krishnan, who directs the Medical Humanities, is here with us. Thanks, Lakshmi, really appreciate it. We've been talking about this for a long time. Certain medical humanities related things like pandemics got in the way. But I'm delighted that we can actually do it. I will introduce our speaker, Dr. Lloyd Maeve Houston, in a minute. I just want to give you a preview of the next few weeks. I think I say this every time. We have a very busy few weeks coming up. Exciting few weeks. Our next event will actually be in Belfast. So you're all off the hook, except that it will be online and live streamed. It is the 5th annual event in the increasingly ill-named trilogy of Bridging the Atlantic conferences. It's a conference on Atlantic policy. For those of you who are Global Irish Studies Fellows who come from all disciplines, I know we've had a lot of history, we've had a lot of literature. Now we have politics and economics coming up. I think especially for you, we have the trade envoy to Northern Ireland, Joe Kennedy, the 3rd, I think, 4th, I whatever, Kennedy, the 5th, the 6th. And we'll have conversations on cybersecurity and politics across the Atlantic. We'll have conversations on climate politics. So the Bridging the Atlantic series is a series of conversations about EU-US relations as channeled through Ireland as a bridge between the EU and the US. And this is the 5th year. It came about as a result of Brexit and the Ireland being the last English-speaking country remaining in the European Union, and thinking about it, how it sort of translates in some way the US and the EU experience to each other, and has done that for a long time. So that's coming up on the 14th of November. I think it starts at 8 o'clock in the morning because we will be 5 hours ahead of you, and it will be live streamed. We will share. It'll also be recorded. We'll share that with you. On the 16th of November, 2 days later, we'll be back in person for Enrico Ternoni, who is a James Joyce scholar. He'll be talking about Joyce's great friend, collaborator and inspiration, Italo Svevo, whom Joyce knew well in Trieste. That's on the 16th of November. And then we have a blowout event at the end of the semester on the 29th of November. We will have 3 great new Northern Irish writers, Jan Carson, Lucy Caldwell, and Michelle Gallen, who will come here, and there'll be a little bit of a sort of a pizzazz, gala, whatnot affair in the ICC lecture hall, so in the International Cultural, what's that called? Intercultural Center? Something, okay. Lecture hall, the 29th, that's the evening, I think it's at 5 or 5:30, 29th of November. And that will be it for the semester. Phew! We will be done. We have really appreciated you being with us, and we will see you again, hopefully in person for Enrico Ternoni, and also on the 29th. 29th will be really fun. It will be a conversation, a little bit of a reading, an hour long, and it will bring us in touch with some of the most exciting writing on the island of Ireland right now. We are grateful, as always, to the Embassy of Ireland and the Northern Ireland Bureau for helping us put on these coming events, and they're particularly sponsored by those. Tonight, however, we have Dr. Lloyd Maeve Houston, who will be talking about the north of Ireland, modernism, and the medicalization of sex. I was advertising this on Twitter through our Global Irish Studies Twitter account, and I thought, could I promise that it will be probing, or would that be kind of rude? It will be probing, I think. It will be a penetrating talk. It will be really fascinating. I've known Lloyd Meadhbh's work for some time, admired it for some time. They are a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in English at the University of Cambridge, where they also hold a position as a senior postdoctoral researcher at Trinity College in Cambridge. Their work explores cultural politics of sexual health, queer history. You may have noticed we've had a sort of a focus on queer history throughout the semester, this semester, and the history of erotica and obscenity. That's why I made that joke. I think it's a reasonable joke to make. And their work has appeared in publications such as the Journal of Medical Humanities, Times Literary Supplement, and the Irish Times. And their first monograph, based on a PhD from, or a DPhil, I suppose you would call it if you had to, from the University of Oxford. Their first monograph is Irish Modernism and the Politics of Sexual Health. And I assume this talk emerges from and will, in a way, elaborate on the work of that monograph, recently published by Oxford University Press. Alongside their academic research, they also engage in outreach work around gender diversity and trans inclusion, and co-host a brilliant podcast called Censored with Aoife Braniff. So we are delighted to have Lloyd here, and really looking forward to this talk. Again, it's been, and I'm going to build this up, but we've been waiting for a few years for this because we had promised to do this. Also because you had a postdoc fellowship in Alberta, right? But it was sort of pandemically delayed and put off in that fellowship. I think you basically did that remotely, more or less. So there was an expectation that Lloyd would be here a little bit earlier. So that's why we have been waiting for some time. So Lloyd Meadhbh, over to you. Really looking forward to this talk. Will go for about 45 minutes, and there will be time for questions. And please, if you're feeling peckish, if you need a drink, we won't be upset if you just go out and help yourselves, especially if you just walked in. There is some food there. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for that very generous welcome, Colleen, and thank you, Colleen, Lakshmi, Chris Caroline, for having me. It is a pleasure, as you noted, kind of deferred, but only intensified, I think, by that sort of deferral. And I suppose, deferred pleasures seem kind of cognate with what I'm going to be talking about. So I also, any puns about penetration, very welcome. Like most of my academic work begins pun first, and then, the paper is written to sort of sanction the pun. This paper, as Colleen sort of adumbrated, emerges out of this sort of monograph and doctoral work, and is in some ways an exercise in self-flagellation. This is me taking myself to task for a degree of sort of unconsidered partitionism, I suppose, in the sort of story of Irish modernism that I told in that monograph. There were good reasons for sort of hewing to the events that I did in telling that story, but it did kind of necessarily shortchange the North. So I'm here today to kind of remedy that. I propose to do that by exploring the ways in which modernist writing from the north of Ireland registered and responded to the medicalization and politicization of sex. I'm just checking, do I need to unmute in order for this to be recording? No, that's all good. Sweet, cool. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So while the social, political, and cultural impact of emerging notions of sexual health have been relatively well canvassed in relation to the literary culture of Dublin, the Free State, and Ayr, their implications for writing emerging from and centred on Belfast, Ulster, and the North, pre and post-partition, have received less attention. Through an exploration of the writing of the chap on the right of that image, Forrest Reid, who's a queer sort of Belfast novelist who's been largely kind of neglected in kind of all accounts of Irish literature, really. This paper offers a sort of preliminary survey of how literary culture in the north of Ireland engaged with local, national, and international debates over sexual hygiene, birth control, fertility, and eugenics in order to identify the particular inflection that they received in a northern context. At the same time, it also seeks to identify the particular political and aesthetic ends to which authors such as Reid might deploy sexual health discourse and the notionally extramoral normative framework it appeared to afford. In both instances, by reading Reid's response to the medicalization of sex in conversation with more kind of conventionally canonical Irish and Anglo-American modernist engagements with the topic, I hope to demonstrate how attending to the social history of medicine in 20th century Ireland can facilitate an interrogation of the borders and boundaries within which we situate Irish modernism and the bodies it dramatizes. Just by way of, I'm conscious that we've got a mix of Irish studies people, medical humanities people, potentially literary studies people more broadly. And so they can't take anything for granted in terms of prior knowledge. What I will say is hopefully that will generate a situation where at some point everyone in the room will get to feel smug about something, but also that at other points you'll learn something. But just to clarify what I mean by the North of Ireland, what I'm sort of referring to here principally are the 6 counties that after partition in 1921-22 become the state Northern Ireland. I will be using the terms North of Ireland, Ulster, Northern Ireland broadly synonymously. I'll tend to invoke Northern Ireland when I'm talking about the state, so sort of post-partition. Also, obviously, the thing with Ulster is that there are 3 kind of bonus counties in Ulster that don't become part of Northern Ireland, but as a kind of wonderfully bitchy map I found from around partition points out they didn't form part of Edward Carson's homogenous Ulster. Carsonia, the Great Betrayal. I was delighted when I came across this. But yeah, so that's how that will be functioning. So anyway, having defined ish Northern Ireland, what do I mean by sexual health? While the term itself is an anachronism, I use sexual health in my work to denote the normative ideal of good sexual conduct, which emerged from and contributed to the medicalization and politicization of sex in 19th and 20th century culture. So those sex and health were subject to normative regulation long before, as a succession of familiar figures from Michel Foucault, Sandra Gilman, Alan Giammi, and others have demonstrated in this period a proliferation of discourses concerning sex, health, and their interrelation occurred, such that it became difficult to conceptualize one without reference to the other. Here are some, so much has been written on this topic, but here are some salient examples. In this emergent scientia sexualis, to use Foucault's well-worn phrase, sex came to constitute a sort of unstable pathological field requiring categorization, diagnosis, and therapeutic medico-legal intervention. Sex particularly lent itself to this sort of medicalization because, through its corporeality and its procreative effects, it constituted a privileged point of intersection between the body, conceived as a sort of locus of discipline and hygiene, and the population, conceived as a sort of multiple unity subject to broader biological processes which determined its perceived health. As a result of this, questions of hygiene, personal and social, autonomy, particularly as they pertained to an individual or group's perceived capacity for sexual self-regulation, heredity, conduit through which individual pathologies and perversions were believed to inscribe themselves at the population level, and fertility, which determined the rate at which this process occurred, became unavoidably political aspects of sex and its regulation. As much of the best work in the new modernist studies has sought to illustrate, modernism, particularly in its literary manifestations, was especially responsive to this medicalization and politicization. Indeed, in the view of figures such as Heike Baer, A.K. Schaffner, Paul Pepys, and others, the stylistic, discursive, and conceptual exchanges between literary modernism and emergent scientific and medical fields such as sexology were so extensive as to render them kind of mutual participants in the emergence of what might be termed a sexual modernism, in which generic and disciplinary divisions between literary and scientific discourse are kind of often placed under erasure. While the moral monopoly of the Catholic Church has prompted figures such as Tom Inglis to question the applicability of this paradigm to late 19th and early 20th century Ireland, the work of Maria Luddy, Susanna Reardon, Sandra McAvoy, Diane Urquhart, Lindsay Byrne, Laura Kelly, many others, has testified to the ways in which a medicalized and politicized conception of sex informed Irish policy, discourse, and social conduct, albeit in often decidedly conservative ways. At the same time, a growing body of work in Irish modernist studies, my own included, has sought to demonstrate that while the specificities of Irish social, political, and cultural life necessarily serve to distinguish the forms that sexual modernism took in Ireland from its European and Anglo-American counterparts, these idiosyncrasies tended only to heighten its significance as a matter of public debate and a source of artistic inspiration. I'll do a quick shameless plug here for the book in miniature. This is principally to afford you the opportunity, should you wish to kind of ask questions about it later. But in terms of the sort of content, it adheres to this sort of paradigm of the four components of sexual health I outlined, and moves broadly chronologically from the sort of Parnell split and the figure of Parnell as this kind of manifestation of a sort of hygienic autonomy and virile celibacy that's then catastrophically shattered, obviously, by the revelations of the O'Shea divorce case, into the Playboy riots, which unavoidably sort of turns on questions about, degeneration and kind of heredity, and it's also saying this kind of persistent tendency to figure Irish Ireland as sort of incestuous in its kind of myopic cultural isolationism. Through syphilis and Joyce, because of course, and the way that the regulation of sort of venereal disease functions in his work, into debates surrounding the Censorship of Publications Act in 1929, which infamously prohibited all printed matter pertaining to birth control and contraception, and became this kind of focal point for a lot of attempts to, different interested parties to sort of stake their claim to political and cultural relevance in the emergent state, but also exploring the ways through, the work of someone like Kate O'Brien, how women actually had a say in this as well, which has gone, virtually kind of ignored in historiography, at least on the cultural side of things. And then concluding with Flann O'Brien and the ways in which he sort of documents the exhaustion of this topic and its kind of zombie-like quality into the 1960s. So we can come back to those slides if we wish at some point, but I baked in a kind of tiny little preview there. Anyway, in both Irish studies more broadly and Irish modernist studies more specifically, however, with some notable exceptions, discussions of sex and its medical legal regulation in Ireland have tended, tacitly or explicitly, to focus their attention south of what would eventually become the border. That this should be the case is not necessarily all that surprising. For fairly obvious contextual reasons, historiography concerning the 6 northern counties has most often tended to focus on questions of sectarian strife, political antagonism, and state and paramilitary violence. As Leanne McCormick puts it, the politics and political violence of 20th century Northern Ireland have overshadowed social history in general and women's history in particular, and I would add further to that, the history of sexuality is more particularly still. This historiographical asymmetry, of course, includes not just the place of women and gendered and sexual minorities in the social, cultural, and political life of Ulster, but the extent to which gender, sexuality, and the perceived relationship to the health and well-being of the population and the state could inform precisely those dynamics of strife, violence, and antagonism, which have so animated historians working on the North. The work of figures such as McCormick, Greta Jones, and the scholars involved with the Queer Northern Ireland project currently underway at the University of Ulster and Queen's University Belfast have illustrated the ways in which a medicalised and politicised conception of sex was a legible feature of life in what would become Northern Ireland, or at the very least, kind of Belfast throughout the 20th century. At the most mundane level, this research makes clear, it's my favorite sign in the whole time, this research makes clear that notwithstanding the region's infamous religiosity, where sex was concerned, Ulster did not say no as frequently or forcefully as has popularly been supposed. Throughout the early 20th century, the 6 counties that would eventually become Northern Ireland shared with the rest of the island one of the highest rates of marital fertility in Europe, which it maintained in the face of a continent-wide demographic slowdown. So on the eve of partition, the rate of births in the nascent northern state was 23.3 per 1,000 head of population, compared to 20.4 in England and Wales. By 1935, that gulf had widened, with Northern Ireland experiencing a birth rate of 20.8 per 1,000, in contrast to a rate of 14.7 in England and Wales. While the North may have been prodigiously fertile, this should not be taken to mean that it was, as Jones puts it, innocent contraceptive practices, particularly in its urban centres. I was trying to find a kind of visual correlative for the withdrawal method that wasn't too obscene, and thought that withdrawing pencils was the best I was going to get. But there's evidence that sort of spacing of births and also kind of stopping when people, when women reach a certain age, that indicates that people were taking some kind of, direct sort of account of family planning in this period, particularly middle-class Protestants. Through an analysis of police and court records, McCormick has demonstrated that various forms of abortion were practiced in the north of Ireland throughout the early 20th century. For middle-class women concerning whom relatively little documentary evidence exists because they were less often criminalized. It's clear that it seems likely that this was facilitated in clandestine fashion by their physicians, and thus with fewer negative outcomes, thus less likely to have left a sort of record. In the case of working class women, knowledge of how to end a pregnancy largely circulated informally through community networks, typically at the neighborhood rather than the kind of workplace level, and followed a pattern of escalation proceeding from activities such as douching and the consumption of abortifacients intended to bring on a period prior to quickening to the use of various instruments, medical and otherwise, to terminate and establish pregnancy. These networks, McCormick indicates, were better established in Protestant neighborhoods where clerical involvement in the everyday lives of parishioners was less programmatic and intrusive than in their Catholic counterparts, in which infanticide appears to have been the more common response to an unwanted or unsustainable pregnancy. While they've received less scholarly attention and been the source of less public controversy than their equivalents in the 26 counties, the 6 northern counties played host to a network of Catholic and Protestant Magdalen laundries, reformatories, and mother and baby homes that sought to address the perceived issues of sex work and single motherhood in a broadly comparable manner to their southern counterparts. Historiographical notice has also increasingly been taken of what Tom Hume has characterized as a recognizable queer male culture of urban cruising in public and private spaces and sexual relationships based not just on desire, but opportunity, power, and payment in late 19th and early 20th century Belfast that shares many of the hallmarks of larger metropolitan sexual cultures in this regard, albeit one situated within what he characterizes as a peculiarly Irish network of places that extended from stately homes in rural Ulster to English public schools and from Belfast boarding houses to the Liverpool docks. So, there is a sense in which the Irish in the north of Ireland lived a sexual life as, as rich and complicated as that of any other place, albeit with, very particular sort of inflections on sectarian lines at times. More pertinently for the present discussion, this body of scholarship has revealed the extent to which sexual health was a legible, if contentious, element of public discourse and civic life in the North in the first decades of the 20th century. As Jones has illustrated, though its Dublin equivalent never really took concrete shape, from its inception in 1911 to its dissolution in 1915, the Belfast Eugenics Society enjoyed a robust and engaged membership that encompassed high-ranking representatives of the clergy, academics, and medical officers. Inaugurated by a lecture from Leonard Darwin, son of Charles and president of the London Eugenics Education Society, the society existed, as its chairman, Charles Frederick Darcy, Bishop of Down Connor and signatory of the Ulster Covenant, put it, to make the public aware that, quote, members of the inefficient, feeble-minded, subnormal class in the community were at present multiplying at a most enormous rate, whilst those of the effective class, the normal or the able, were increasing at a much smaller rate, and to call upon them to take action to prevent, quote, the marriage and multiplication of the unfit before all the abler stock were wiped out. This action took concrete form in the Society's unsuccessful efforts to have the 1913 Mental Deficiency Act, a pet project of the British eugenics movement, extended to Ireland, a measure resisted by Irish MPs on grounds not of conscience, but of cost. As the composition of the Society's membership and supporters illustrate, concerns over hygiene, autonomy, heredity, and fertility, as we saw sort of clustered in Darcy's remarks there, particularly as they pertain to the urban poor and the physically and mentally impaired, were alive and well among the governing elite of the northern capital. The ongoing currency of these concerns in the north was demonstrated when, 2 decades later, Belfast played host to Ireland's first dedicated birth control clinic. The Mother's Clinic, located at 103 The Mount, a working class neighbourhood near the Harland Wolff shipyards and not far from the city centre, although it's obviously much gentrified now, and supported by the Mary Stopes Society for Constructive Birth Control, opened in November 1936. The clinic emerged from a combination of Stopes's growing ire with the Free State's pronatalism, enshrined in both the Censorship of Publications Act and the Criminal Law Amendment Act, and the activities of the Northern Ireland Society for Constructive Birth Control, which enjoyed the support of figures such as Evelyn McDaniel, a Queen's University Belfast trained physician who became the clinic's first doctor, W.S. Kerr, the Church of Ireland Dean of Belfast, and Northern Ireland Labour Party MP Harry Meadhbh. For Meadhbh, an advocate of cross-border cooperation in social, economic, and cultural matters, the prohibition of birth control constituted a major barrier to closer relations between the two states. Even a cursory glance across the border, Meadhbh claimed, revealed, quote, huge families of puny children of the labouring classes, mothers old and worn out at 40, poverty, sluttishness, degradation, disagreeable abnormalities of sexual behaviour, numerous illegitimate children, and many cases of infanticide that the properly administered, obviously, availability of birth control might have remedied. Contrasting the two jurisdictions, one of which he framed as secular, prosperous, and egalitarian, the other of which he presented as priest-ridden, impoverished, and oppressively sectarian, Midgley asserted that happy, secure family life can be encouraged far better throughout a country by high wages, steady employment, and good social services than by rigid application of doctrines that inflict more suffering on a minority than they do good to the mass of the people. While such pronouncements are nothing to write home about in the context of birth control advocacy, I mean, Midgley here is basically parroting Stokes all but verbatim. They are telling in an Irish setting, insofar as they reveal the extent to which the question of fertility and its regulation could be leveraged to bolster Northern Ireland's often rather fragile self-conception as a modern liberal democracy. This could lead to frankly ridiculous claims, such as Midgley's assertion that, quote, the legislation directed against birth control in the Irish Free State is a more grievous danger to individual liberty than a Special Powers Act, and in Ireland has caused more death, a contention with which those prohibited from assembling, interned without trial, or sentenced to flogging under the auspices of Northern Ireland Civil Authorities Special Powers Act might have wished to quibble. The clinic ultimately foundered because financial support from local and national government was not forthcoming, tacitly and sometimes explicitly on the grounds of religious sensitivity, which is an important qualification to Midgley's boosterism concerning Ulster's secular modernity. But its existence attests to the ways in which the social and political conditions could and did conspire in the North to produce something recognizable, I think, as sexual modernism. Having sketched this context, my aim in the remainder of this paper is to offer a kind of provisional exploration of the ways in which you might think about the relationship between literary modernism and the medicalization of sex in the North through the figure of Forrest Reid. And I want to do so by kind of starting with Reid's approach to one of the key conceptual elements of sexual health I identified earlier, autonomy, and the way it kind of complicatedly intersects with some of the other elements that I identified. Reid is born in 1875. He's kind of unique in even among kind of Irish modernism, the modernists, in that he basically never left the country really for any sustained period of time. So he grows up in Belfast, in and around the sort of university quarter, and spends regular sort of periods in Newcastle and in County Down, and barring a brief attendance at Cambridge as a mature student, so he's there when he's about 30. He basically otherwise just remains firmly kind of in and around Belfast. Nevertheless, he participates in a sort of network of correspondence that does take his interest, more widely out into the kind of Anglo-American literary world. So he's corresponding rather in an awestruck fashion with Henry James, who allows Reid to dedicate his first sort of major novel to him, The Garden God. However, that is sort of ruptured whenever James is rather kind of scandalized by quite how kind of legibly queer it is. He also, as you can see from this photo of the two of them together, is friends with E.M. Foster. He also corresponds a great deal with Walter de la Mare, and kind of maintains an interest in sort of sexological sort of circles. He goes, kind of largely unnoticed, apart from winning the James Tate Black Memorial Prize in 1944 for Young Tom. You can see there, his sort of output. So in my work on Irish modernist conceptions of sexual health, as I alluded to a while back there, I've explored the ways in which the Parnell myth, Charles Stewart Parnell's carefully cultivated public persona, and the paradigm of hygienic self-rule upon which it was premised, bequeathed to figures such as Yeats and Synge and Joyce a model of kind of modernist artistic vocation in which sex was treated with a fairly sort of profound ambivalence. So, it's what kind of people like Joe Valente have charted in terms of the sort of double bind of masculinity in this period, right? One must be virile and potent, but one must not be excessively sort of virile and potent, right? Strong passion, strongly checked. This received its kind of medicalized turn through the sort of emergent conception of perversions, right? So what was once a kind of individual moral failing now becomes a kind of innate pathological tendency towards certain forms of sexual activity and sexual excess. The eugenics movement kind of uses this sense of people with uncontrollable passions as one of its bases for sort of ruling certain populations, as basically, kind of ready game for sterilization, institutionalization, and so on, right? In order to kind of vouchsafe the liberal democratic polis, certain members of that polis must be sidelined because their overbreeding might swamp the kind of state. There's a sense in which I'm interested in who might be a kind of comparable figure in the North, and I feel like Carson might be a good candidate for that. But that's a conversation for another time. In the context of Read's writing, this fetishization of autonomy, right, a capacity for self-rule, and concomitant suspicion of desire inflect and are inflected by his queerness, and most particularly, and from a contemporary standpoint, troublingly, by his pederasty. As numerous commentators, chief among them Read himself, have noted, the defining feature of his writing, alongside and closely intertwined with its preference for the pastoral and Hellenism, is its focus on adolescence. Opening his first volume of autobiography, Apostate, in 1926, Read identifies the primary impulse of the artist as a kind of crying after Elysium, a divine homesickness and longing for an Eden that, for Read, was always to be found in boyhood. So he says there is a sense in which many of the protagonists of his novels are mere pretexts for the author to live again through the years of his boyhood, and to live those years, as it were, more consciously, if less happily. As Read himself was the first to admit, this nostalgia for a prepubescent kind of paradise, or a pubescent paradise lost, manifested itself not only in the content of his writing, but also in its form. In a much quoted passage from the opening of his second volume of autobiography, Private Road, Read recounts how, as an author, he could get on swimmingly in the composition of a given text until he reached what he identifies as his presiding obsession, quote, the point where a boy becomes a man. Then something seemed to happen. My inspiration was cut off, my interest flagged, so that all became a labor and not a labor of love. I suppose it must be some mysterious form of arrested development. This apparent incapacity or unwillingness to venture beyond the point of normative sexual maturity in his writing forms a significant structuring element in Read's narratives, which typically break off around the point at which the protagonist of a more conventional Bildungsroman would be expected to consummate their inchoate longings, either through marriage and reproductive sexual activity, or at the very least through the sort of hedonistic pursuit of libidinal gratification. While this impulse can be and has been plausibly explained in relation to Read's own fraught psychosexual development, he does it himself there with that arrested development comment, it's my contention that it also constitutes an at least semi-conscious effort on Read's part to square the circle that normative masculinity, particularly as was articulated in emergent notions of both sexual health and modernist artistic vocation, demands in relation to desire and the challenges it poses to individual self-rule. If Yeats, Joyce, and Synge vouchsafed the hygienic autonomy of their protagonists by insulating them from the compromises of heredity and reproductive sexual activity, we might think of Cuchulain's sun-slaying in On Bollia's Strand, or Stephen's horror at the word fetus in A Portrait of the Artist, or Christy Mann's endless thwarted efforts to slay his own father in Playboy. Read guarantees his aesthetic avatars a measure of the same sanitary self-rule by developmentally stranding them just on the cusp of manifesting, or at the very least consummating the urges that might lead to such compromising activity. In a very real sense, then, Read's is always and very deliberately a portrait of the artist as a young man. How does this play out then in Read's fiction? To see these dynamics in action, we might turn our attention to Following Darkness, a Künstlerroman which documents the coming of age of Peter Waring, a fiercely independent young man who lives with a staunchly Presbyterian father in a cottage at the foot of the Mourne Mountains, depicted here. Regarded with a mixture of, they're gorgeous, aren't they? Regarded with a mixture of love and suspicion by this undemonstrative patriarch who fears that he will take after his actress mother and abscond from the family home in pursuit of a life of pleasure, Peter's iconoclastic temperament and artistic sensibilities are cultivated through his visits to Derryachy, the neighbouring big house, which I'm assuming is modelled after Donard Lodge, whose aristocratic owner, Mrs. Carroll, who I'm assuming is a version of the Dowager Countess Priscilla Cecilia Annesley, took him under her wing following his parents' separation. The novel's plot, such as it is, turns on Peter's relationship with Mrs. Carroll's niece, Catherine Dale, presumably modelled after Priscilla Elizabeth Annesley, whom Peter believes to be the reincarnation of her ancestor Prudence Carroll, whose portrait he has fallen in love with during his visits to Derryachy. They're sort of shades of a portrait of the artist at play, or no, of Dorian Gray in that kind of relationship with portraits. While Catherine appears to reciprocate his affection, she can never live up to the supernatural ideal he has constructed for her. And when the pair are reunited after a year apart, which Peter spends with working class relatives in Belfast, of whom more later, Peter unsuccessfully attempts to take his own life by spending a stormy night exposed to the elements on the coast. Having survived a resulting brush with pneumonia, Peter is told he must live overseas for the good of his health, and ends the novel being cradled by Mrs. Carroll, who declares her maternal affection for him. It's a slightly batshit novel, as you can kind of hear. It's very gripping, but it's a lot. What the summary includes is the extent to which Peter's personal and aesthetic development are framed in relation to a medicalized conception of sex, and the issues of hygiene, autonomy, heredity, and fertility with which that is bound up. So following his first afternoon alone with Catherine, during which they briefly hold hands, Peter slips out across the Royal County Down golf links into a secluded grassy hollow overlooking the sea and engages in a bare-breasted act of ecstatic communion with the living and breathing earth, which I think it is fair to say means he has a big old wank. The earth beneath me was living and breathing, and obedient to some obscure prompting of my body, I turned around and pressed my mouth against the dry grass, closer and closer in a long, silent embrace. It was very well there was no one there to observe this exhibition of primitive and internal instinct. I felt a passionate happiness and excitement. My head was bare. The salt, sharp smell of the sea seemed to have set my nerves tingling, and I unfastened my shirt that my breast might be bare also. All the past had slipped from me, and I lived in this moment, squeezing out its ecstasy to the last drop, as I might the juice of some ripe fruit. It seemed to me that I was on the verge of finding something from which all my previous existence had been but one long preparation and search. I was fumbling at the door of an enchanted garden. In a moment it would swing open. Already the perfume of unknown flowers and fruits was in my nostrils. My feeling was deep and pure and clear as a forest pool. Well, indeed. As in Synge's The Aran Islands, which Reid possessed a copy of, and Synge's abortive autobiography, to which he wouldn't have had access, it exists only in manuscript, the ethnographically inflected category of the ideal of sort of primitive sexuality is conscripted here to sanction a more frank and disinhibited engagement with sex than Edwardian social mores permitted, by framing it as more natural and healthy than its modern counterpart. We can see that, the deep, pure, clear feeling, right? However, where someone like Synge leverages the admittedly vexed category of the primitive to frame the pre- or asocial sexual license of the Aran Islanders as a kind of salubrious alternative to the pathological squeamishness he attributes to Catholicism and the Gaelic revival, Reid deploys the category to more idiosyncratic ends. In contrast to Synge's celebration of primitive sexuality, which he ultimately conceives as conforming to civilized norms, which is to say, presumably, reproductive heterosexual sex between healthy adults, Reid frames Peter's rapturous onanism as a means by which to gain entry to the ageless Hellenized Elysium toward which so much of his writing strains. Thus, while this moment notionally marks Peter's fervent eruption into heterosexual maturity, he replays this moment later in bed while imagining kissing Catherine, it functionally serves to suspend him safely on the perpetual cusp of that same persistently deferred maturity. Adolescent libido, rather than acting as a gateway to a more fully realized adult sexuality, instead here becomes a portal to simply more adolescent libido, right? Peter Waring becomes a kind of randier Peter Pan. Where other modernist authors and contemporary sexologists might figure masturbation as a kind of form of sexual solipsism, inferior to more companionable erotic acts, for Reid, Peter's thinly veiled act of ritual onanism is framed as implicitly superior, or at least preferable to allosexual activity, insofar as it is uncontaminated by the presence of another party who might infringe upon Peter's salubrious independence, even as it simultaneously affords him access to a higher species of intimacy with nature itself in some, kind of more pantheistic way. So how does this interact with questions of sort of hygiene and heredity? Well, with that, we have to move to Belfast. The correlative of this autoerotic primitivism is, as might be expected, a deep suspicion of urban modernity and its corrupting effects. While Reid, especially in his life writing, tends to kind of pastoralize Belfast, focusing more on its semi-rural suburban fringe and its more affluent neighbourhoods to offer a benignly romantic portrait of the city, in Following Darkness, he figures his hometown, particularly its working-class commercial centre, as the vulgar, materialistic and insalubrious epitome of industrialisation and urbanisation at their most corrupt and corrupting. Sent to live with the down-at-heel with his down-at-heel relatives, the McAllisters, in cramped lodgings above their tobacconists and stationers on Cromac Street in the city's market district, Peter cannot mask his revulsion. Inwardly, I was furious with my father for arranging for me to come and live in such a place, with a public lavatory hardly 10 yards away, and facing the windows, the crowded street, the mean, dingy houses, the mean, dingy people, the noise and rattle of innumerable trams. It was all disgusting, even beyond my expectations. And I was to live here, I simply wouldn't. You can get a sense of quite how sort of bitchy protagonist Peter is. The McAllisters are as unprepossessing as their surroundings, comprising the paranoid and belligerent Aunt Margaret, Peter's father's sister, whose growing mental instability eventually sees her knock him unconscious in a drug-fueled rage. The henpecked Uncle George, who meekly refuses to acknowledge the severity of his wife's condition, no matter how extreme its manifestations. The, quote, singularly unattractive Gordon and Thomas, quote, the kind of children who have perpetual colds and are never provided with an adequate supply of pocket handkerchiefs. The strange, elf-like, and extraordinarily fragile Alice, an otherworldly 10-year-old who manifests both a worryingly intense affection for Peter and a no less concerning tendency to slip dead mice into the family soup tureen at lunchtimes, and George, a big red hobbledehoy of 17, who spends his nights constructing increasingly Byzantine erotic fantasies and keeps a cache of photographs of, quote, extremely lightly clad women under the floorboards of the bedroom, Peter is obliged to share with him. As that kind of dismal genealogy, which we are told includes, quote, several others who had died in infancy, suggests, Following Darkness's vision of Belfast as a hub of disease and debauchery is legibly indebted to degeneration theory, a pseudo-medical amalgam of neo-Lamarckian theories of evolutionary and cultural decline that enjoyed immense currency in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially among those who wished to critique what they believed to be the pathological effects of urban life. We see here the sorts of genealogies that provided of, decline from kind of immorality into, kind of genital paralysis, which is a byword for the late stages of tertiary syphilis, into the probable extinction of the family. We have Kraft Ebbing telling us how, periods of moral decadence lead to effeminacy, sensuality, and luxury, which put increasing strain on the nervous system and so on. And obviously, Max Nordau famously, really kind of popularizes all of this through his study degeneration, which tells us that artists can be as, corrupt as criminals as well. The most obvious manifestation of such degenerationist thinking in Following Darkness, and just checking is the increasingly noxious influence George is shown to exert over his cousin's psychosexual development. We still shared the same bedroom, and at night he liked to talk about before going to sleep. His influence was bad, absolutely. And yet, what was so harmful to me did not, so far as I know, have any particularly disastrous effect upon George himself. He had an amazingly licentious imagination, and in this direction, a power of vivid suggestion. My mind became disturbed, we are told, and above all, my dreams were colored by certain obsessions which George took a delight in evoking. His words appeared to touch me physically, and with an appalling directness and persistency. This pattern of intrusive eroticism reaches its climax when George shows a reluctant Peter his collection of erotic photographs and coerces him into what is heavily implied to be a kind of non-consensual act of mutual masturbation. I saw him go to the hiding place he had shown me on the night of my arrival, and again take from it that mysterious bundle of photographs. He came over and sat down on the side of my bed. "I don't want to see them," I said, pushing him away, but he only laughed. "Don't be a fool," he answered brutally. "I'm not going to do you any harm." He drew them from the envelope and showed them to me one by one while the gas flamed and flared above our head. The Peter Waring Reid's 1937 revision of Following Darkness makes the implications of this even more explicit by sort of resequencing the dialogue, so that it concludes with him, the cousin looming over him saying, "I'm not going to do you any harm," which I think more heavily adumbrates perhaps what's to follow. Leaving aside its relationship to real-world patterns of abuse and incest within Irish families, an issue which Reid, to his credit, kind of addresses with a measure of nuance and psychological insight. Peter is sort of traumatized by this experience in a pretty legible way. We might ask what this sequence is intended to demonstrate about Peter and his temperament, and what role it serves in the novel's sort of pseudo-Künstlerroman format. As you've probably inferred already, this moment, which we may situate within the continuum of scenes of traumatic sexual initiation and enigmatic signification, which Joe Valente and Margot Bacchus have identified as emblematic of modern Irish culture's approach to narratives of sexual Bildung, serves as the contaminating urban counterpart to the primitivist scene of ecstatic, heather-scented communion with the earth we discussed a moment ago, where the former moment constituted a transcendent affirmation of what Reid frames as Peter's fundamentally natural and healthy affiliation to Deriaki and the somewhat nebulous nexus of aristocratic, Nietzschean, Hellenistic, pagan virtues with which he associates it. Reid presents George's predatory conduct as an exemplary manifestation of the grubby mercantilism and unhygienic overcrowding with which he associates working-class Belfast. We're told the McAllister's home was stuffy and uncomfortable, and so small you felt everywhere beneath the table the warm proximity of other people's limbs. I hated being cramped in this way. It seemed to me that all the time I was breathing other people's breaths. And once I got this notion in my head, I could not forget it. In contrast to the hygienic independence emblematized by Peter's feat of pagan self-love on the slopes of the Mournes, unwelcome sexual contact with George serves as simply the apotheosis of a contaminating claustrophobia so pervasive as to consistently teeter on the verge of incest. At the same time, this sequence also seems to betray a marked ambivalence about the relative roles of heredity and environment in determining character. On the one hand, it seems intended to testify to the apparently innate superiority of Peter to his cousin and the circumstances that have produced him. Where George is seemingly immune to the effects of his amazingly licentious imagination, Peter's heightened aesthetic sensibilities, represented by his capacity for vivid and often supernaturally inflected dreams, render him uniquely susceptible to this unwelcome influence. On the other hand, the ease with which he internalizes these seemingly contagious erotic obsessions prompts Peter to wonder whether he might be hereditarily predisposed, presumably through his mother's perceived sexual misconduct, to undergo the kinds of degeneration he imagines himself to be experiencing. You can see, again, this sort of blurring of environment and inherited influence at play in a lot of these sort of degenerationist texts. In the midst of reading George Meredith's The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, a Bildungsroman about a father's increasingly authoritarian efforts to educate his son and preserve his sexual integrity after his wife abandons him for a poet, Peter reflects on his own development. I knew that for months past, my mind had been gradually submitted to a poisonous influence that had filtered through my blood like a vapor from some fever-breeding marsh. Yet certain seeds, I thought, could perhaps only have taken root within me, and could perhaps only so quickly have sprung to tall, dark flower because they had found the soil apt to receive them. And I remembered my father's suspicions in the past. I thought of a book I had been reading lately, a book written for boys and all about boys, and I compared myself with its heroes. I compared the gloom that weighed upon me now with the troubles they had experienced, and it seemed to me I must be different, not in degree, but in kind, from every boy in that book, from the bad just as much as the good. I wondered if I were quite abnormal, but how could I ever find out even that? For just as nobody knew what I was, I knew nothing. I knew nothing really of anybody else, save what they cared to show me or took no trouble to hide. Peter's sense that he differs not in degree, but in kind from Meredith's models of masculine Bildung, the bad as much as the good, in a manner that renders him, in a suggestively diagnostic piece of diction, quite abnormal, crystallizes this ambivalence over the nature of his distinction from his peers, even as it metatextually seeks to set his novel, Reed's novel, apart from its Victorian realist forebear. In moments such as these, Following Darkness seems to sort of teeter between naturalism and decadence, unable to determine whether the perceived squalor amid which its Belfast sequences are set is truly sort of squalid, as a Zola or Maupassant would render it, or whether it's an incubator or something closer to the kind of interesting disease to which Arthur Symons famously likened literary decadence. At the apotheosis of this crisis of sexual self-disgust, Peter determines that his best hope is to confess to a priest, where crises of sexual self-disgust are concerned, apparently only Catholic ritual will suffice. And he begins circulating Belfast churches, auditioning clergymen. In a revealing reflection of Reed's awareness of the city's architecture of containment, to borrow James Smith's evocative phrase, the most hopeful candidate is found at St. Mary Magdalene's on the Donegal Pass, the Church of Ireland chapel, which from 1849 to 1916 served as the dedicated place of worship for the inmates of the Ulster Magdalen Asylum. With characteristic reticence, Reed neglects to mention this connection directly, but seems to allude to it in his characterization of the delicate and ascetic-looking priest whose worn face gave the impression of one who had made a fight against something. Possibly it had been ill health, and who had come out of the struggle victorious, if not unscarred. A description which seems to gesture not only to the priest's own experiences of illness and adversity, but also to his ministry and to those to whom he has been ministering. Tellingly, this tacit visit to a home for fallen women, which, as the work of Leanne McCormick has illustrated, played host not only to sex workers, but also unmarried mothers and other women who find themselves pregnant in socially stigmatizing circumstances, it prompts Peter to confide in his best friend, Owen, for the first time about his family history and his parents' separation, and to raise the spectre of potential illegitimacy. Curiously enough, although I'd been so reluctant to mention that my father was a national schoolmaster, it did not trouble me in the least to talk about my mother. I even had some dim notion that made me perhaps rather interesting. So I told him all I knew. I've not seen her since, I wound up, and perhaps my father is not my real father. Why I should have thrown this aftertouch, I cannot conceive, as I'd never in my life had the faintest doubts concerning my legitimacy, but I suppose it was to heighten the romance. As the metatextual allusion to the interesting quality his parents' separation confers on him, and the heightened romance his uncertain heritage grants his narratives makes clear, Reed is here sort of drawing attention to the ways in which the novel has been scripted in conscious, albeit often sort of playful conversation with the medicalized and politicized conception of sex, upon which emergent notions of sexual health and the sexual modernism to which it gave rise rested. Whatever the truth of Peter's speculation about his parentage, as I've sort of sought to illustrate thus far, questions of heredity and their connection to issues of hygiene, both personal and social, autonomy, both sexual and aesthetic, and fertility are a central component of Read's novel and its vision of modernist aesthetic vocation in the north of Ireland. So to sort of conclude and also not conclude in ways you'll see, Read is undeniably a deeply and at times kind of uncomfortably idiosyncratic figure who eludes easy categorization on aesthetic political grounds, and his perspective is in many ways sort of too unique to form the basis for generalizable claims about basically anything, let alone cultural attitudes to sexual health in the north of Ireland. However, as perhaps the best known and certainly the best regarded author to emerge from, reside in, and consistently write about Ulster in the first half of the 20th century, he's as good as it gets for us. And he certainly merits consideration in any attempt to outline the origins and development of modernism in the region. As Rebecca and Barr asserts in one of the best pieces of criticism available on the man, as a case study, Forrest Read challenges conceptions of nation and of acceptable queer sexuality and demands a broader and more nuanced historical contextualization with reference to fields such as modernism, psychology, and Iranianism. While I can't claim to have offered an exhaustive contextualization of Read in these domains, I hope that this paper has gone some ways toward teasing out the ways in which his writing, through its engagement with the medicalized and politicized conception of sex that underpinned emergent notions of sexual health and the concerns over hygiene, etc., that it's bound up with, participates in and responds to the sort of emergence of an identifiable sexual modernism in the north of Ireland. At the same time, however, kind of unconclude, it's also worth briefly acknowledging all the things with which Read's writing does not explicitly engage, the most glaring of which are, as I'm sure at least some portion of you have been sort of screaming internally for the last half hour, are precisely those elements of sectarian political antagonism and state and paramilitary violence, which, as I noted at the outset, have so dominated historiography of the north of Ireland. You know, to take the example of Following Darkness, the novel follows Peter from his birth in 1875. His life is keyed to that of Read's own, and proceeds to follow his development until he is around 17, which is to say until roughly 1892. Yet the novel contains no references, explicit or implicit, to take just a few examples, land agitation, agrarian violence, first Home Rule Bill, the second Home Rule Bill, Snell's rise to power, the O'Shea divorce case, the split in the Irish Parliamentary Party that precipitated, or any of the ways in which all of these developments precipitated the emergence of an increasingly bellicose and partitionist strain of unionism in Ulster, topics about which his biographies are also no less taciturn. This is doubly surprising, given that the novel was published in October 1912, at the very height of the crisis precipitated by the introduction of the third Home Rule Bill to Westminster in April, and mere weeks after Ulster Day, during which Read and over 500,000 other unionists queued at a mass rally orchestrated by Sir Edward Carson and James Craig at Belfast City Hall to sign the Solemn League and Covenant drafted by Thomas Sinclair. Indeed, the date of Peter's mysterious and premature death, given as the 10th of September 1911 in the novel's fictional preface, seems intended to eschew any possibility of the young protagonist's life being read in connection with the turbulent political context amid which it was composed. In light of these rather obtrusive omissions on Read's part, there are a range of questions I would be keen to address in developing this work further, or to kind of explore through other authors. Most pressingly, I'd be eager to kind of examine the extent to which the process of rapid militarization that took place in the north amid the Home Rule crisis yielded the same medically inflected fetishization of hygienic masculine autonomy that characterized the rhetoric of the Gaelic League and the activities of organizations such as the GAA and Sinn Féin in the 26 counties in the same period. If so, who emblematized these virtues and their attendant paradoxes in the cultural and political life of Ulster unionism, as, for example, Parnell had for a time in the nationalist and subsequently kind of modernist imaginary? How might, for instance, the public persona of a figure like Carson be understood in these terms? And what impact might his decisive role in the prosecution of Oscar Wilde have had on the framing of him in the political and literary culture of the North? Were the same degenerationist anxieties and eugenically inflected rhetorics of racial purity and resurgent national vitality that characterized the project of de-Anglicization and censorship in the emergent Free State leveraged to make the case for partition as a sort of cordon sanitaire vouchsafing Ulster's physical and cultural integrity? Did the same sectarian divisions and questions of cultural value that shaped the debate over the Censorship of Publications Act and its prescriptions around birth control in the Free State inform debates over the regulation of fertility in the North? And if so, how did the notional legality of contraception reflect those conversations? If such considerations were at play, how did the writing and lived experience of women in the province complicate and contest them? More broadly, how did a medicalized conception of sex inform the perceived role of women as avatars for and symbolic and literal reproducers of the nation? And finally, which authors, playwrights, and cultural commentators from Belfast, Ulster, or the North might take on a new significance as contributors to Irish modernism when read through the prism of their engagement with medicalized and politicized conception of sex. Or put another way, how might attending to the cultural politics of sexual health in the north of Ireland allow us to take proper stock of the region's contribution to Irish modernism? And how might the canon of Irish modernism and critical accounts of its emergence and development be reconfigured as a result? But to hear the answers to those questions, I guess you'll just have to invite me back in the future. So thank you very much for your attention.
Will you take some questions?
Absolutely.
All right, we probably have 15 minutes or so for questions. Thanks for, I think at some point, coincidentally, we have over the last month heard a lot about the early decades of the 20th century, and a lot about how those early decades of the 20th century felt quite different in particular communities than the sort of standard narrative of a kind of constricting conservatism in the South and emerging different kind of conservatism in the North. And at the same time, we have these characters that we've been hearing about through Maurice Casey's work and also Carl O'Canlan, your work, these characters who were living these sort of fantastically queer, interesting lives, even in, under the banner of the alleged conservatism of the 1920s, 1930s. Obviously, it was a little bit earlier. So anyway, thanks for that and bringing us back to that. Well, that's all. I think I'm like have an agenda here. I know. Thanks for that. And we've spoken to questions I have asked, but I will sit down and answer for a while. Well, can you moderate questions from there, right?
Yeah.
I'm bursting with questions. First of all, thanks. That was just brought joy to my heart. So what a delightful talk. Many things, but I'm really curious to how you situate this work into a broader cultural history in medicine. It struck me as you were especially discussing syphilis and venereal disease of the skin, around the advent of syphilis testing, the rise of laboratory medicine, and just more broadly, this idea of diagnosing the social body and diagnosing the body politic, and essentially the conversion of a population, perhaps the population of Northern Ireland, as nascently pathological, thinking before and et cetera. So I was just wondering if that comes up in technologies of testing and surveillance, maybe not in the 4-3, but perhaps in some other sources. I'm just entirely curious how this fits into that problem.
Yeah. No. It's, I mean, that is, absolutely, one of the ways in which, that this sort of biopolitical regime is making itself manifest. I mean, there is one syphilitic in Following Darkness, but it's interesting how that figure, it's the brother of Catherine, the sort of love object in this, who we're in a weird sort of moment of prolepsis, we're told will become syphilitic almost beyond the horizon of the novel. But in a way that seems to belong a little more to like decadence and its way of kind of handling these things rather than this more explicitly medicalized sense. In terms of the material I've sort of surveyed in my own work, Joyce is the figure who does this most kind of programmatically, although Kate O'Brien also centers some of her writing around this. So Joyce in Ulysses is very interested in kind of the ways in which sort of efforts to contain and regulate VD, both medically and kind of through vice crusading sort of efforts play out. Circe, that sort of famous episode of Ulysses that, set in the sort of nighttime, the Monto, contains, like all sorts of versions of that. You have kind of, there's a point where Bloom's father sort of gestures toward an ape that's been inoculated by Mechnikov, and Joyce is definitely sort of playing with the relationship there. It's not just the fact that Mechnikov literally did try to inoculate simians with syphilis, but also the kind of evolutionary, the kind of simianization of the Irish there, I think, is in play. And there is a sense in which kind of political, one of the reasons Joyce is so interested in all this is because it's a big part of the Sinn Féin playbook, rhetorically, in terms of how they want to kind of, position British rule as corrupting. So throughout 1906 into 1907, there's a series of articles in Sinn Féin, the publication, including ones by Oliver Gogarty, Joyce's kind of frenemy, who was himself a trainee medical doctor. His articles are uglying, and they're this kind of awful fusion of kind of lambasting the English for being venereally diseased, but also figuring them as kind of making that synonymous with what he presents as their sort of anthropometric Jewishness. You see this also rear its head in oblique ways in the Limerick pogroms. A lot of the rhetoric around the Limerick pogroms frames the Jewish as kind of in the Jewish community in Limerick as pathologically kind of over-sexualized. But you also get Kathleen Lynn, who helps found the sort of maternity or children's hospital. She co-authors a Sinn Féin circular on public health as part of the Sinn Féin Public Health Committee, where it comes out in 1916, I think, where she basically says, look, when however many 100,000 men who are serving in the British Army come back from the war and enter the population, all of them syphilitic, because of course they are, because if you're in the British military, you immediately, are riven with syphilis. It's going to run rampant through the nation and destroy us. And if she leverages an analogy between it and tuberculosis, where she's sort of like, if someone just showed up with like a boatload of tubercular people and just let them loose, we would regard this as an act of, she basically frames it as sort of germ warfare. So it has a pretty robust sort of salience. Wearing a slightly different hat, so that's the kind of cultural work it's put to do, or like political work it's put to do, I suppose. But just at the level of actual kind of lived experience as well, I was lucky enough to be pointed toward a cache of letters by the archivist of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, from various venereal disease sufferers and their families to a guy called Thomas Percy Claude Kirkpatrick, who was kind of the main VD specialist in Dublin, and thus had a really wide catchment because the VD service was very unevenly sort of introduced in Ireland. And I was kind of astonished by what I found in those letters, which was really just, there's about 120 something pieces of correspondence, and there's obviously the caveat that presumably their experience of their illness has been inflected by or informed by the treatment they've received, and presumably by the vocabulary he's provided them with. But I was expecting, all the kind of classic stuff of like, a rhetoric of shame and stigma and, kind of performative apologies for, being in this condition. Very direct, very medically inflected kind of register being used to describe condition. I've had a recurrence of discharge. I've been douching like you told me. I've, laundered my sheets. Like, what else should I be doing? People getting in touch with them to sort of say, look, I'm separating from my husband. Can you provide me with a letter proving that he infected me? People also trying to use him to kind of leverage other aspects of a kind of emergent system of welfare. So sort of being like, look, my lodgings are crap. Can I come back to the hospital? Or like, here, I need some teeth. Can you write to this board and tell them I need teeth? So, without wanting to say that Ireland was actually, a place void of stigma around sex, but, there would be an insane claim. There is a sense in which, partly just, it seems like under the aegis of one pretty good doctor for at least a certain portion of the population living in and around Dublin, a fairly sort of modern, for want of a better or less loaded word, sort of relationship to, and he really kept abreast of like, he sampled best practice everywhere. He has papers from across the sort of Anglophone world in terms of how stuff's being kind of treated and diagnosed. So there's this odd set. I mean, basically, as with so much of like Ireland's relationship with modernity, it's profoundly, it's combined in uneven development. It's unevenly distributed. But in the urban centers particularly, there's a real sense in which, the state has available to it this capacity to sort of, think of its population in biopolitical terms, and interested political parties have this rich rhetoric that they freely avail themselves of. Like, there isn't a group in Irish politics through the early 20th century who doesn't accuse someone else of being syphilitic. There's my better half tells a story about, I think it was like her maternal grandfather, you know, till the day he died, anytime De Valera was brought up, it'd just be like, that syphilitic bastard, which, you know, gives a flavor of this.
Can I, is there another question here? Can I ask you, no, an unrelated, totally unrelated question, following it, but I was really interested in, you know, you laid out this story of the problem of reproduction, people have too many children, nothing, section of all of these problems of, and then that leads us into questions of eugenics and heredity, all of which are around child making, childbirth, inheritance, and yet at the same time, you know, we're talking about Forrest Reed as sort of a queer figure engaging in or thinking about queer sexual practices that may or may not have anything to do with reproduction. And I guess I wanted to, because all of the fear seems to be directed towards, you know, it's a sort of classic Monty Python, like the capitalists are being to do thing, right?
Yeah.
There's like a whole other of sexual activity that in which you cannot in any way accuse people engaging in that kind of sex of reproducing themselves necessarily outside the sort of social reproduction. But when we're talking about the medicalization of this, social reproduction doesn't mean much anymore. So I guess I wanted to ask you to unpick those or square the circle or something, or sort of think about that relationship between a fear of reproduction and then a sort of a concomitant related fear of a non-reproductive sexual activity.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's if I were being my own critic, I would say that there are elements of like this talk that don't fit together terribly well, but that Reed, in ways I was sort of trying to allude to, doesn't actually fit terribly easily into. Like, there's a version of the sort of narrative of what the medicalization of sex does that a figure like him kind of eludes in ways you were suggesting there. I mean, obviously, you know, the classic sort of story of the pathologization of queerness partly turns on this sense of, you know, queer sex being, or, you know, non-reproductive forms of sex being inherently pathological, right? You know, people from Kraft-Ebing onward, you know, kind of basically, it's kind of fascinating how easily a kind of, you know, Judeo-Christian conception of sex as needing to be reproductive just slips into the kind of medical sense without much explicit explanation being given for why that should be the case. What I would say is, in my reading around the way this plays out in the North, which is indebted to and inflected by, you know, Tom Hume's work and Dan Morris's, you know, I'm so delighted that that project is underway. One of the older things that Tom seemed to tease out is that, like, queerness doesn't seem to be terribly robustly or kind of urgently policed in Belfast, at least in the ways that it would be in other urban centres. Like, there are periods where the scrutiny that it's subject to intensifies, the First World War most obviously, but, you know, while it obviously comes with a heavy sort of social stigma, there's not as programmatic a kind of seeking out of the, you know, the queer figure in terms of their deviancy, or an attempt to kind of, you know, institutionalize on that basis, as far as the, you know, the record exists to show. One of the things I'm interested in, so I sort of that, you know, that speaks to the sort of lived reality side of this to some extent. One of the things I'm kind of interested in, and in a way that puts me slightly at odds with some aspects of how queer modernism gets talked about, is that you know, there's a kind of recuperative side to the project of talking about queerness and modernism that obviously wants to kind of celebrate the anti-normative stance of many of the parties involved. But I'm often interested in the ways in which, in often slightly undigested or uninterrogated ways, this sort of normative model of sexual health kind of haunts them or gets interpolated into the ways that they try to kind of sanction their own deviancy. So like someone like Kate O'Brien is a really interesting case in this regard, where in order to sort of attempt to carve out space for greater sexual agency for women and for greater emphasis on women's pleasure in a, you know, sort of Stopesian mode, she winds up kind of getting signed up to some quite uncomfortably eugenic kind of ways of thinking and talking about sex. And there's this weird sense that, like, yes, on the one hand, her writing features many instances of non-reproductive sex and, you know, kind of libido but is often kind of haunted by this odd sense that, you know, but like reproductive sex would be good. Like there are a lot of her characters who are kept from being together because of, you know, Catholic social order. We sort of mourn the fact, like, oh, they'd have such good kids, you know, like, oh, it'd be, there's in a novel like Pray for the Wanderer, which is her most sort of explicit kind of attempt to rail against De Valera's Ireland. It's the book from 1938, just after she's been banned and just after the sort of referendum on the new constitution. There's the protagonist of that, who's a sort of gender flipped version of herself to some extent, is in a relationship with this actress from London who is herself married to this very queer coded kind of probably bisexual, but also potentially sort of ace-ish kind of actor, like screen actor, who, you know, who's preening of himself and his kind of cultivation of his personal beauty and so on, leaves him no energy to fulfill her needs. And you know, and the both the character and the narration kind of are very much just like, but like, love, I'd bang the living shit out. Like, we would have such great kids. And so there's this odd sense that, like, in the pursuit of greater sexual liberty in certain domains, the persuasiveness of normative rhetorics of kind of medicalized sex get conscripted in ways that then prevent these figures from being progressive in the way that we might want them to now for the purposes of, you know, a more inclusive syllabus, or, you know. So I'm always interested in you know, how this sort of, like, it's a similar thing to when we were talking about Sean Kennedy earlier. I think I really pissed off Sean when I sort of you know, talked about had an article about it became a chapter in the book, but like about Beckett's kind of antinatalism and the ways that early in his career, in a slightly unexamined way, perpetuates these, you know, kind of all of that Malthusian, you know, sort of like, oh, these Catholic overbreeders are going to ruin themselves. He eventually circles back in late career to kind of take himself to task for this. So something like First Love, that novella that hovers between sort of being set in Vichy France and in kind of Free State Ireland, you know, Beckett is really having a go at himself for the way that his antinatalism coexists with, or might lend itself to, that kind of eugenic thinking. But it's, you know, we can't just be like, oh yeah, you know, it's like Lee Edelman, but like, you know, 70 years early, like, this is amazing, you know, someone being like, just screaming abort, abort, abort at a woman, or threatening to like kick her in the cunt. His words, not mine. You know, that's not kind of necessarily it doesn't leave a lot of room for fellow traveling, let's say. Sorry, that went wide, but I hope it sort of answered part of the nexus of your question.
Think about the complexity of all of these desires to be somewhat progressive and then also conservative, to think about, you know, medicalization allows for certain freedoms and unfreedoms at the same time. Sorry, I didn't say that was a great answer. Thank you. More questions?
I just have a quick question, but because we have the slides, which I was really curious on the slide of one of the eugenics slides. The portrayal of eugenics was both like having to do with trees.
Oh yeah.
And although I'm modernist and even a medical humanist, I hadn't seen that before. Like those two, and I'm just curious, you know, you having delved into that, is that common?
I mean,
like,
partly this is,
or is this just sort of something that's sort of self-selected, like for the era? What is that?
I mean, certainly. So obviously, part of this is you know, just me scrabbling around on Google. But I was aware that the provenance of these images, I think they both come from the Eugenics Education Society. So they're at least representative of the way British eugenicists were metaphorizing this. I mean, this one obviously. So this one is kind of
the roots.
Well,
the roots,
but here it's the roots of the things that feed into eugenics, I think, right? So I'm not sure how legible it is because the resolution of the image, but you know, it's mental testing and psychology and biology and genetics. This one is just like here's a good tree, family tree, here's a bad family tree, and we need to cut down that tree, with, we've got, father unknown, mother mentally defective, daughter mentally defective, husband unknown, son normal, oh, good for him. Somewhere prostitutes before 15 years old, really, very normal woman, man of scientific ability. It's like philosopher, normal woman, not normal women just being trying and this thing with gold medalists, so
Yeah, I just, as a scholar of visual culture, like you put up that sign, it's like, what? It's a powerful visual metaphor, is all.
no, 100%. I mean, it's
Indeed, it leaves on that branch, it's not living.
Yeah, it's a way that, no, 100%. I mean, I'm assuming that these sorts of resources are, coexist with these sort of charts here, or kind of people, these exhibitions. I mean, that's I'm not sure how clear it is, but that's an anthropometric laboratory, so you can take sort of, you can subject yourself to phrenology and whatnot. But yeah, no, I mean, I wish I knew more about the sort of visual culture of eugenics and that kind of communication, but it's yeah, I mean, but you can also see here how the broad category of the natural is being leveraged from all sorts of angles, right? The tree metaphor provides its own self-evidence of the proper growth, and even though the processes by which trees propagate themselves don't really bear much relation to people, but it's all part of the same kind of coercive force, the natural sort of accumulates. I mean, I would be also intrigued to think more about the way that like Reid's pastoralism does or doesn't partake of this, like how far does it infiltrate the Elysium that he sort of evokes. But if it's a great question.
Thank you for indulging.
No, anytime. I'm sorry, yes.
Sorry, I don't know if anyone I just want to ask, I noticed that in Following Darkness, the characters were mainly portrayed as participated in this sort of like supposedly unfit hereditary behavior. They were mainly part of the lower or so I was wondering if any of these opinions about who was fit to like procreate and perpetuate their lineage, did that extend to classes as well as geographical location, urban versus rural?
Oh, 100%. I mean, it's endemic to eugenic thought in this period that, one of the animating anxieties of eugenics is the differential birth rate, the idea that the middle classes, implicitly because they're practicing birth control, because they're more prudent about how they marry up the sort of resources they have available to nurture children with the number of children that they have, because they are capable of regulating their sexual behavior, their birth rate is slowed. But the working classes, the urban poor, who are often treated as functionally indistinguishable from the physically and mentally disabled, who lack a capacity for self-regulation. Like, a lot of this, there are people in this, period who stringently kind of criticize eugenics on this grounds, right? So the Labour Party, parts of the Labour Party are quite keen to get on board with eugenics, and Fabian socialists are kind of amenable to it, but parts of the Labour Party are like, this is just self-congratulatory aristocracy sort of, posturing. Like someone like G.K. Chesterton, in Against Eugenics, which he publishes in about 1922, but he's on about this from the get-go, from about 1905. Like he is, sort of reviewing eugenic texts and being like, this is just the, history being written by the victors, but like, kind of genetics or something, right? In a way that completely occludes environmental factors. One of the things that British eugenics gets really sort of tangled up in is trying to understand the extent to which environment plays a role in this. So how to kind of unite eugenics with a kind of new liberal sense that like the state should intervene to improve the living conditions of people, and that, so there's sometimes this kind of like Shaw is one of those people who's sort of like, okay, if we abolish private property, then everything will be equal enough that then eugenics can happen, right? So, at that point, people will truly be free to kind of mix and mingle, and there won't be issues of class to inflect this. But yeah, the urban poor are a big source of anxiety. And you can kind of see that, like Irish eugenic discourse, there's less of it, but there's just less Irish eugenic discourse, full stop. I mean, but it's certainly not absent. There's a sense that you see there in that Darcy quote I gave, where he was sort of like, sometimes our charitable efforts are making the problem worse, i.e., in letting more of these poor people live, we are perpetuating the problem, you know? So yeah, it's, I mean, Darcy's a weird guy. Yes, on that cheerful, you know.
Lloyd, for a really fascinating talk. Lots and lots to chew on. So yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it. So hey, I will now, like, that sounds like fun. I didn't teach. But thank you very much. Thanks for coming. It's been a pleasure having you. Thanks to all of you for listening.
Thank you so much.
Feel free to ask questions informally, mingle, eat more, cheese and whatnot. Thank you. One day,